post-traumatic stress syndrome. Now, post-traumatic slave syndrome is referred to as multi-generational trauma because of the 300 years of continuous trauma during slavery. Now, before I go into describing this term, which was coined, I want to look at the words post, trauma, well, we all know slave and syndrome. The word post could be used in different sense. One of them, it could be used to represent a stout piece of timber that is set upright, right? The word post could also mean after or behind. These are the different ways in which the term post could be used. But in this case, we are talking about the after effect, which is what we refer to as the trauma or generational trauma. What is trauma? Trauma is caused by a wound. All right? Now, let's talk about slave in relation to stress. The slaves underwent stress, which is in relation to hardship, affliction, force, pressure, physical strain, legal restraint, overpowering adverse force, and emphasis. This is the issue of stress that our ancestors underwent. All right, and the term syndrome, which could be equated to the word disorder, it means to put out of order. It means to derange. It means to modify after a particular order. All right, so in other words, if something is orderly and you put it into disorder, then that would be a syndrome. All right, so now that we have a clear idea what the different words mean that makes up this term, let's now talk about this multi-generational trauma that occurred over the period of slavery for 300 years. But let's bring it to us in this age and understand that the residual effect has affected us mentally and emotionally. How so? Let's talk about the experience of our ancestors. First, our ancestors was captured by people who look like them, if not their own clans or tribesmen, by neighboring tribes. And of course, in most instances, these neighboring tribes in West Africa would have been blood related to the captors. So the first thing we must know is that we were captured by people who looks just like us. The second thing we experienced is, of course, during being captured, during the abduction, we would have been abused and beaten. So that in itself, just being captured, carries some measure of trauma. Because remember, trauma has to do with it being caused by a wound. So the first thing, we were captured. We were also abused, beaten into subjection so that we would go onto the ship. Second part of the trauma is we were shipped. Let me talk about that just a little bit. Most parts of West Africa is not on the coast of Africa, meaning many of our ancestors would have lived inland and in most instances would not have ever seen an ocean. So there would have been shock, which causes another form of wound to the mind because you are now being forcibly exposed to an environment that you would have otherwise never has been exposed to. Remember, if someone told you that there was an ocean and explained to you what the ocean looked like and what it was good for, what it was used for, psychologically you would have been prepared for making such a trip. But when a person is abducted and forced into a strange environment, it causes the person to be shocked. Okay? So when we're talking about trauma, not just being captured, not just being abused, but also being shipped, going on board a vessel that you may not have been familiar with in any way. All right? After our people was captured and abused and were taken into a strange environment, boarded a strange craft, when they arrived in the West, they were sold. So every aspect of our ancestors' experience was quite traumatic. All right? They were sold and then they were abused again. They were beaten because normally if a person is in a strange environment, they are shocked. They've never even seen a white man. And they're in a totally strange place. They are not going to adapt very quickly to this new environment. So normally they were cajoled, they were beaten, they were forced to adjust. So that beating is what they would have referred to as the breaking in period. And during the breaking in, they were abused. Not acclimatized. They were not given the liberty of having the time to adjust to their environment. That is not the experience of our ancestors. Beyond being abused violently, then there is the issue of rape. Our ancestors were raped as part of the breaking in process also. And this is not just women. This would have also included men in order to emasculate them, to subjugate them. So our ancestors, because of all these different forms of abuse and trauma that they experienced between being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on, would have produced what is called survival behavior or adaptive behavior. So one now has to think, how would our ancestors adapt or even survive that type of situation where there was continuous denigration? Well, the survival behavior and the adaptive behavior that our ancestors adapted was that they would denigrate themselves and each other as a protective mechanism. So they would denigrate themselves to protect themselves, which is referred to as what I just mentioned of adaptive behavior while living in the hostile environment. Right? The example that I started to give in the other part of this video, I mentioned a mother denigrating her child so that the slave master would not know of the child's ability, the child's intelligence, the child's skill, to avoid that child being taken by the master and sold to another plantation. which was a regular occurrence. Because as long as the master realized that there's a child here that has skills and that has abilities, he would sell that child for a higher value than all the other children that are also being sold to the other plantation. All right? So beside that form of demigration, which I have to explain is very damaging to a human psyche. Because if a child is exhibiting characteristics of intelligence and skill, and in the presence of the child, the mother denigrates the child, it damages the child. So that child in their mind would be thinking, but I'm doing everything to please my mother. I'm doing my best to please my mother, and all she does is puts me down. So what happens to this child? This child becomes damaged after the fact. So we understand how the post-traumatic effect, which is caused by the child being injured, by the child having a wounded emotion, a wounded feeling of inadequacy because of their mother's failure to recognize and accept